Welcome to On Track. I'm Aisha Jaffer. The First Amendment is often quoted, debated, and invoked in courtrooms, classrooms, and protests alike. But in 2025, many Americans still ask, what does the First Amendment actually protect, and where are the boundaries? Today, we're focusing on two key rights, free speech and the right to assemble. We'll look at what those protections really cover, where the legal limits are, and how they show up in protests, online, and everyday life. Joining us are two people with deep expertise in First Amendment law. Bob Corn-Revere is chief counsel at FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. He's been a First Amendment litigator for more than 40 years, defending free speech in courts, on college campuses, and across industries. Before joining FIRE, he spent 2 decades as a partner at the law firm Davis Wright Tremaine and served as chief counsel to an FCC chairman. His work has earned him national recognition, including multiple Lawyer of the Year honors for First Amendment law and a spot in Washingtonian Magazine's Top Lawyers Hall of Fame. Bob, welcome to On Track.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
We're also joined by Amber Duke, Executive Director of the ACLU of Kentucky. Amber has been with the organization for nearly 14 years, serving as its first communications director, first deputy director, and the first Black woman to lead the organization. Amber, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
Bob, just to ground us, just to get us started, can you give us a clear definition of what the First Amendment protects?
Well, the First Amendment protects more than just speech. It protects actually 5 freedoms: freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to petition, and freedom of assembly. And each of those protects a dimension of conscience and public discourse. And
how would you describe the real world scope of those protections?
How long do we have? The courts have spent a century trying to work out those definitions. The first that we saw the courts really beginning to carve out what we think of as First Amendment doctrine was really beginning in the 1930s. And so that law has been evolving in the decades ever since. And it really kind of is defined by the real world conflicts that we see that they become the cases that then define the extent of how much the First Amendment protects.
So I want to zoom in on freedom of speech, and I want to talk about each of your organization's definition of it and what kind of work you do to protect that specific right. I'll start with you, Amber.
Sure. I was going to add to what Bob was saying in terms of how the First Amendment it ends up being defined through the courts. And I think, the ACLU nationally has been around for over 100 years. The ACLU of Kentucky, we're celebrating our 70th anniversary this year. And so much of, our history nationally as an organization and even here locally have been a part of bringing these cases that really are helping to define, from what people think of as more traditional speech to in recent years, we've had cases around online speech and, people posting on government officials' Facebook pages. So I think, the venues obviously have evolved. But in terms of free speech and the ACLU of Kentucky in particular, I think we've been working on this issue on a number of different levels. So I think here in the context of Louisville, where we've been most visible and what we currently still have active is a lawsuit against the Louisville Metro Police Department in their response to the protests for justice for Breonna Taylor that happened just a few blocks from where we're sitting. And we saw LMPD officers violating the rights of peaceful protesters being hit with tear gas and pepper balls and that kind of thing. And so that's a case that's still active that we'll probably talk a little bit more about as we discuss, have this conversation today. Also, at a state level, I think that we have been seen a lot of instances of the Kentucky General Assembly really sort of attempting to flex in the area of speech. And there are ways that these intersect with other rights. And so there have been attempts at compelling the speech of doctors and saying what doctors can or cannot counsel their patients about in the context of reproductive freedom and access to abortion. In recent years, there have been attempts to control the speech of teachers and whether or not that they can use the pronouns of their students in the classroom in some anti-LGBTQ litigation. And of course, we have folks, some for the first time, who are coming out into the streets across the nation, who are protesting, using their protest rights against things that are happening with the federal government. And we're seeing in new ways, especially the federal response to attempt to suppress this speech and using even the military to do so.
Same question to you, Bob. What kind of work do you do to protect the freedom of speech with your organization, FIRE?
Well, FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, is 25 years old, so we don't have quite the same longevity as the ACLU yet at this point. But it was founded 25 years ago to deal with campus speech and due process issues, and for most of this time has been Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. But a little over 2 years ago, FIRE broadened its mission to deal with free speech issues in general, and we deal with the wide range of First Amendment and free speech issues across all of the areas, some of which Amber mentioned, and we're involved in a number of those kinds of cases as well, especially in the area of new technology, dealing with social media regulation, and also traditional free speech areas like the right to protest, the right to have your voice heard. And we address this not just from the perspective of the law. The law of free speech is what we see as sort of the floor for what should be accepted. But we want to promote more broadly than that a culture of free expression where people are open to engage with those they disagree with. And we promote all kinds of civil discourse so that it's a bolder and broader idea than just the minimum, the law of free speech.
So we talked about this a little bit. Amber, I feel like you addressed this. Who is actually defining what counts as freedom of speech? Is that solely the courts, or are there other forces or benchmarks shaping how this right is understood?
Yeah, I think as Bob was sharing, I think that there are many things that are at play here. We simply, the spirit of the First Amendment right is to acknowledge the power of the people to express themselves, to express their dissent and disagreement with the government. So, not to get too philosophical, but truly, I think that that these are rights that are embodied in each of us. They're, rights that are embodied in us as a community. FIRE, initially was focused on a campus community, but I think that there are many different communities that we are a part of, that our ability to express ourselves, to express our dissent to the government are tied up. So it isn't just simply, something that is tied up in a bunch of legal cases and doctrine. Like that can help us sort out when we have sort of like problems and issues that come to bear. But I truly think, it is the First Amendment, right? I do think that it is a cornerstone of our democracy. It gives us the ability to speak on and act on many of the other rights that we have.
Bob, anything to add?
I think that, yeah, I think that's right. And it's important to remember that the right to free expression is rooted in individual conscience. That's why religion is part of the First Amendment. But religion, I think, only captures part of what we think of as, the freedom of conscience. It goes much more broadly than that. And also speech involves more than just political speech, more than just the right to protest or the right to petition the government. It also includes artistic expression. And so that there's anything that can be put into expressive form is something that the First Amendment protects.
So are there types of speech that we might not think about that maybe aren't protected under the First Amendment or freedom of speech under the First Amendment?
One of the things about First Amendment law is that, and because of the American principle enshrining the First Amendment as a primary right, is that speech is presumptively protected. That means that under the law, you can't punish speech unless it falls into a narrow series of categories that the courts have recognized over the years. And that includes things like obscenity, incitement to crime, defamation, those kinds of very limited and carefully defined categories that sort of define those areas where the government may regulate. But the floor, the presumption, is that speech is protected.
And so I know, Amber, you mentioned a few cases, and so did you, Bob. Are there any recent court cases or situations that you've been working on that highlight how free speech protections are being upheld or even challenged right now? Amber, I'll start with you.
Sure. I, mentioned our Scott v. Louisville Metro case, which is a case that we filed in the fall of 2020 after LMPD engaged in mass arrest and, again, as I mentioned, using tear gas and flashbangs and pepper balls, which are really weapons of war, against folks who were peacefully protesting. So a lot of people were impacted by that violence. Some of the clients that we represent have permanent injuries, loss of eyesight because of what they suffered. And we also saw, of course, here in Louisville during that time, we actually had a National Guard call out that happened here in Louisville during those protests. And there was a person that was killed, David McAtee, who was killed in West Louisville. I think we're sort of seeing mirrored currently on a national stage what we saw play out here in Louisville. We've had folks across the country who have come out in masses to protest a number of things, but specifically, most recently in Los Angeles, ICE activity in their neighborhoods, folks being rounded up in workplace raids and grabbed off the street. And we saw, the President of the United States call out the National Guard, which, is something pretty extraordinary. I think maybe only the second time in our country to have, a National Guard call out in that way. The first time that, the military force was being used against civilians to suppress people's speech. So, I think that, and so that happened in Los Angeles. It's still happening. I think I saw a video yesterday of the mayor of Los Angeles was in a public park and there was still National Guard that was there. We have local officials saying, hey, we can handle this. We don't need federal and military law enforcement coming into our community. And as local officials, we have a responsibility to protect the First Amendment rights of folks who are coming out and expressing their frustrations with the government about ICE activity. So in some ways, I think what we saw, here in Louisville a few years ago is just really a small microcosm of what now is playing out in the country pretty dramatically.
Bob, do you have any recent cases showcasing, upholding, or challenging this First Amendment right and free speech?
Well, it has been, as you might imagine, a fairly active time. We're working on, as I mentioned before, challenges to state regulations attempting to restrict access to social media in Utah and Texas and in California. We are continuing to, with our core original mission, defend student speech, including students who wanted to wear hoodies with political messages in their high schools and were sanctioned for that. We're involved in Texas in a couple of cases involving efforts where university presidents decided they were not going to permit drag shows on their campus. And it's also in Texas, we're representing a journalist who was arrested by the local police simply for asking questions and then publishing the answers. That case is, we're now petitioning the Supreme Court to take that case. And in one of our more high-profile cases that I'm working on personally, we're defending a lawsuit filed by President Trump against the Des Moines Register and Iowa pollster Ann Selzer, who, because she had found in the poll 3 days before the election that Kamala Harris was leading in Iowa, something that turned out not to be true. Trump sued her and the Des Moines Register for violating the state anti-fraud law, consumer fraud law. And so we're defending against that frivolous lawsuit in the state of Iowa.
Well, thank you so much. We'll be back in a minute. You're on track with Louisville Public Media. Hi, it's Aisha Jaffer, host of On Track. As a fan of the show, you may be wondering how you can help support this hyper-local podcast that focuses on topics and conversations that affect us and our community. One of the best ways is by donating at lpm.org or by becoming a sponsor of On Track. We work hard to create diverse and engaging conversations featuring guests from Louisville and Southern Indiana. To learn how your business can sponsor On Track, contact Tracy Karam at tkaram@lpm.org. It's a meaningful way to support both the show and the community while aligning your brand with important local conversations. Thank you.
Why does the United States pay higher drug prices than other countries? Because America's the only country in the world where 340B hospitals mark up drug prices and PBM middlemen charge billions in hidden fees. Meanwhile, Americans subsidize the research and development for new cures. Other countries benefit, but don't pay their fair share. Crack down on the middlemen. End the free riding. Lower drug prices. Go to balancethescales.org to learn more. Paid for by Pharma.
Welcome back to On Track. I'm Aisha Jaffer, and we're talking about free speech and the freedom of assembly in 2025 with Bob Corn-Revere from the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression and Amber Duke, Executive Director of ACLU of Kentucky. Now, another key First Amendment protection is freedom of assembly. What rights do people have when they gather and protest, and where are the legal boundaries?
Well, the words of the First Amendment protect the right to peaceably assemble, and it's important to keep that in mind. There are a lot of things that can be expressive, but not necessarily be protected, because the First Amendment does not protect property destruction or violence or harming other people. And when you gather large people who are engaged in expressing themselves on highly contentious and highly emotional issues, sometimes things can go too far. And you have to keep in mind that those kinds of actions, when they do cross that line into things that can be punished, that is not protected speech.
And I would just add, I brought visuals, even though we're on a podcast format, but I brought a little Know Your Rights When Protesting wallet card. And I do encourage people, you can visit the ACLU of Kentucky's website, and we have Know Your Rights information for any sort of scenarios, but we do have a wallet card to know your rights when protesting. And we always, encourage people to really sit down before they're going to an event or an activity to sort of read through the rights that they have available, know that their rights are strongest on streets and sidewalks and in public parks. And then also, folks knowing that if they do encounter law enforcement, they're given a dispersal order. There are certain things that are supposed to be included in that dispersal order, including the amount of time that you have to disperse if something has been declared an unlawful assembly by law enforcement. We also remind people that if they are arrested as part of protest activity, there are other rights that they have that they can invoke. So they can invoke their right to remain silent. They can ask the question if they're free to go. So overall, we do encourage people to spend some time and look up this information before that they're participating in activities.
For your visual, where can they find that?
So if you go to aclu-ky.org/KYR, KYR for Know Your Rights, we have Know Your Rights wallets cards for any number of things, and they're downloadable and you can print them out.
That's a really cool. I'll take a picture of it.
Yep. Those are all very good points. It's so important to know your rights and to have that kind of information with you when you are going out to engage in protest. And Amber is right that especially when you're talking about public streets, public sidewalks, and public parks, those are considered to be the public forum. They are protected by law as sort of a First Amendment easement that the government has to obey and encourage people to engage in protest in those areas. It's part of our constitutional tradition. There's also the right, and this has been recognized by the courts in recent years, to photograph the police when you are in a public space like that and, you have a police presence. one of the things that people have done very effectively in recent years is to document what's going on. And I think that serves everybody's interest.
And I want to talk about a recent example here in Louisville. Earlier in July, a white supremacist organization identified as Patriot Front marched through downtown Louisville while wearing masks. The city has a longstanding ordinance banning masks in public, but Mayor Craig Greenberg said that the policy hasn't been enforced when people are exercising their First Amendment rights. How does this situation help us understand the limits of First Amendment protections, particularly when expression may be controversial or provoke public concern? And also, how do laws like mask ordinances or permit requirements interact with those rights as well? Amber, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think that, of course, the mask ordinance here in Louisville, I think, has been a hot topic of conversation over the past couple of years, maybe put in place in the 80s for a particular reason. I think local law enforcement chose to enforce it, as the mayor said, not in a First Amendment context, but when people have been wearing masks as part of robberies or other crimes. I mean, again, as Bob was saying earlier, the First Amendment protections that we have don't protect people, from being punished for participating in criminal activity. I do think, aside from the group that was in town earlier in July, we have had other gatherings. Again, I think that there was an ICE-related action. No King's Day, we had folks that were there that were wearing masks as part of that gathering. I think it's a good thing that the Louisville Metro Police Department, especially in light of the history and very recent history that they've had and being found by the Department of Justice of violating people's First Amendment rights, that they have made a decision to really be protective. And so, that was a decision that they made around First Amendment activity in the mask ordinance. I certainly will be interested to keep an eye to see if it is enforced in the future or how it might come back into conversation. But at this point, it seems that the focus here recently for, city officials has been a posture to be protective of people's First Amendment rights.
Bob, anything to add?
Yeah, I would agree with that it's good that the error is made, if at all, on the side of protecting speech. And I think that presumption is one that should prevail. The mask issue is one that raises a number of really nuanced First Amendment questions. Part of it is because the history of many of the anti-mask laws goes back to the days of the formation of the Ku Klux Klan, where you had a bunch of people riding around wearing masks, terrorizing people. And so anti-mask laws were adopted for that reason. And yet, anti-mask laws can also be really intrusive of people's First Amendment rights. Think of Hong Kong and the protesters in Hong Kong who were being surveilled and their identities revealed because the government wanted to keep track of who was protesting the government. Those kinds of efforts to unmask people or to identify them can be very chilling when it comes to First Amendment freedoms. And so that question of masking or not masking can raise some very difficult First Amendment questions.
So, and that also brings me to how, and we sort of touched on this earlier with the limits or what's not covered, but how does the First Amendment treat speech that may be considered hateful or extremist? Are there any legal boundaries? Or is it more that speech is still protected, or there's kind of a line there?
Well, the answer to both questions is yes. And the presumptive answer is that what you think of as hate speech is protected speech. That if you think of a category like when people talk about pornography is protected speech. Obscenity is not. It has crossed a legal line set forth in court definitions for how far you have to go before you do that. But pornography is just a generic term that relates to sexual entertainment, and so that's generally protected. Hate speech is a little bit like that in that it isn't a legal concept, It is a description of speech that you think of as being unpleasant or hateful or whatever, but it doesn't create a legal category that you can enforce against. Now, there is such a thing as discriminatory harassment that has to meet a rather strict legal test before you can say that it falls into that category. But what you generically think of as hate speech is protected by the First Amendment. And
I, totally agree, and would just add that even though this speech is protected, one of the things that in the ACLU of Kentucky's history is that even though the speech is protected, it doesn't mean that it doesn't cause harm, that it doesn't cause fear, that it doesn't have, that it's not just a philosophical thing. There are real world consequences. We know that, groups like the one who came to Louisville in early July use this as a recruitment tool, right? In order to get folks to join their movement. So there is real power sort of behind it, though we may not have these legal definitions and categories that we look at it. And I'll just share just very quickly something as I've been reflecting on our 70 years as an affiliate. We had a moment here in Louisville, believe that it was in the 90s or early 2000s, where there was a group of Ku Klux Klan KKK members that wanted to protest in downtown Louisville who were being denied a permit. Our organization at the time helped those folks get the permit for their activity. And at the same time, other people in our organization were organizing with community partners on a counter protest to this rally that was being planned. And so, there was a small group of folks who came out for the rally, and then there were hundreds, if not thousands, of people who came out as a counter protest to it. So I think that sort of can show just sort of the power of there is the legal right for folks to say these things, and then also just sort of the powerful aspect of coming together in community in response.
That's such a great example that illustrates the ACLU's proud tradition of defending the rights of speakers, even speakers who they find to be distasteful or hateful, and yet at the same time also helping to work with people who would disagree with them, underscoring the First Amendment truth that the best response to bad speech is more speech, is responsive speech, rather than to try and meet that with censorship.
Well, Bob, Amber, thank you so much for joining us on Track today.
Thank
you so much.
Bob Corn-Revere is the chief counsel at FIRE and a First Amendment litigator for more than 40 years, and Amber Duke is the executive director of ACLU of Kentucky. On Track is a production of Louisville Public Media. The On Track production team includes Michelle Tyreen Johnson, Alex Biscardi, and Laura Ellis. Our music is by Kojin Tashiro. If you're just tuning in and you want to hear the full show, you can find it now at LouisvilleOnTrack.org or in your favorite podcast app. And let's continue the conversation. Is there something you want to hear about, something that matters to your Kentuckiana experience? Let us know by sending us a text or giving us a call at 502-814-TALK or email us at ontrack@lpm.org. I'm Aisha Jaffer, and remember, being kind is free. That's the start of community. Until next time, you're on Track with Louisville Public Media.
Why does the United States pay higher drug prices than other countries? Because America's the only country in the world where 340B hospitals mark up drug prices and PBM middlemen charge billions in hidden fees. Meanwhile, Americans subsidize the research and development for new cures. Other countries benefit, but don't pay their fair share. Crack down on the middlemen. End the free riding. Lower drug prices. Go to balancethescales.org to learn more. Paid for by Pharma.